Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and in this video, I'm going to explain how revolvers work. In the scope of this video, I'm not going to explain how every revolver could possibly work. Instead, I'm going to focus on common elements of revolvers and their function, and how they work in a number of different examples. The examples I have to showcase are limited by those found within the program I use for this demonstration, which you can find in the links in the description of this video. I will also not focus too much on how the hammer/trigger mechanisms work in any of these examples. It is something I have previously covered in my hammer-fired action video. So to start things off, I'm going to identify the three main parts that will be most of the focus of this video, which can be found on my first example, the 1847 Colt Walker, which is a very early example of a successful revolver made by Colt. These three main parts are the cylinder here, which also has another important element, the ratchet in the back of the cylinder. The cylinder stop, which is found here, and you can get a better view of that on the other side here. So this is the cylinder stop, all of this. And then on the other side, we have the last part, the hand, which is found here. This is also known as a pawl as well. Now, the importance of all three of these parts, first starting with the cylinder is what contains the ammunition. In the case of the Colt Walker, this is an old cap and ball style revolver. So if we come down here in the x-ray, you can see the ball, which is the projectile that will be pushed down the barrel. And then we have the powder loose in here. So this is not a self-contained cartridge like what we see with modern firearms. And then the cap is a separate item that is placed on the end of the nipple in the cylinder. So here's the nipple here. So a cap is placed on that. And in the course of firing, the hammer strikes the cap ignites the powder within the cylinder, and then once the powder ignites, it's going to push the bullet down the barrel because of expanding gases that are built up during that combustion. For a revolver to work, the chamber we're attempting to fire off has to be perfectly aligned with the barrel. Now, a chamber is one of these cavities found within the cylinder that contains the ball and powder. And in more modern revolvers, this would contain the cartridge itself. So in the example of the Colt Walker, we have 6 chambers, so we can have a total of 6 balls and powder that we can fire off. Now, the reason why this alignment is important is if this cylinder was slightly off, let's say it was rotated a little bit over to the left so that the chamber and the barrel will not align. Well, once the powder got ignited and those expanded gases tried to push the ball down the barrel, it would instead meet an obstruction because the barrel is no longer aligned. And that ball would have no longer anywhere to go, and the expanding gases would have nowhere to go. And that would be a catastrophic result, as it would try and go anywhere else. And it could result in severe damage to the firearm and a possible hazard to the operator of the revolver. Another important element of a revolver is the fact that we have to rotate or revolve the cylinder to bring the next chamber into alignment with the barrel before we can fire it off. So in the example here, the ball and powder is missing because it's already been fired off. So to continue firing this revolver, we're going to have to rotate the cylinder over into alignment, and then we can pull the trigger and fire off another round. Now, unlike an auto-loading firearm where the energy of the expanding gases is used in some way to bring the next cartridge in line with the barrel so that it can be fired off, a revolver does this entirely mechanically. And to do this in this single action Walker, we have to cock the hammer. So as we bring the hammer to the rear, it's going to rotate along its attachment point with the frame through this screw. And as it does so, it's also going to move the hand, which is attached directly to the hammer by this pin. So as the hammer rotates around its attachment point, it's going to bring the hand upward. And as the hand comes upward, you can see the cylinder rotating. And it does this by pushing up on the ratchet teeth. So as the hand comes up, it contacts the ratchet teeth and rotates the cylinder along its fixed point in the center here, rotates it along that, and brings the next chamber into alignment with the barrel. Now, what keeps that chamber aligned is the cylinder stop here. So the cylinder stop comes up into these locking points in the cylinder and prevent the cylinder from moving out of its alignment. But the cylinder stop has to allow the cylinder to rotate when it needs to. If it remained within this locking notch, the cylinder wouldn't be able to rotate. So as the hammer is cocked backwards, the hammer is going to also act upon the cylinder stop through this peg here on the hammer. And as the hammer rotates along its access point, the peg is going to cam along this end of the cylinder stop, which is going to pivot along its access point of this screw through the frame. So as this end goes up, the other end of the cylinder stop is going to pivot down. And once it clears the locking notch here, the cylinder is free to rotate. And eventually, this end of the cylinder stop will clear the peg on the hammer, and the tension of this flat spring will drive the cylinder stop back up and lock it in to the notch, which in turn locks the chamber and the cylinder into alignment with the barrel. Now what we need in a revolver design is an element of repeatability, so that when the hammer falls forward and we cock the hammer back again, the hand and cylinder stop will operate as they did before. We need to reset these parts to their original position. So as the hammer comes forward, it's going to rotate along its axis point. And just as when it rotated backwards when we were cocking it, it's going to act upon the hand because the hand is directly attached via this pin. But rather than push it up, it's going to do the reverse and pull it downwards. But as it's pulled downwards, it's going to slide along the slope of the ratchet tooth, and it's going to push inward on this flat spring and compress it. And once it goes beyond the ratchet tooth, the compressed flat spring here is going to push back forward on it, bringing it back underneath the ratchet tooth so that when we cock the hammer back again, it will come up, contact the ratchet tooth, and bring it around, rotating the cylinder. So we've seen the hand reset. Now let's take a look at the cylinder stop and its reset. So as the hammer comes forward, the peg is going to contact the cylinder stop. And what allows it to go beyond the cylinder stop is this slope surface here on the peg and the fact that the part of the cylinder stop that is going to contact the peg is a thin piece of metal. It's actually going to slope along that peg, get squeezed inwards, as you can see there. And once the peg goes beyond the cylinder stop, it's actually going to snap back in place, just like a spring. And we're back into position. We've reset the cylinder stop so that if the hammer was cocked back again, it would pivot the peg up into contact with the cylinder stop, pulling it upwards and pivoting this end of the cylinder stop downwards. So there's that element of repeatability. Every time we brought the hammer back and then back forward, we could bring it back and forward again, and it would do the exact same function. The last thing I'm going to showcase with the example of the Colt Walker is the reloading process of a cap and ball revolver. And just like a lot of other cap and ball revolvers, the cylinder on the Colt Walker is fixed, which means I have to take apart other parts of the firearm before I can remove it, which is not exactly convenient for the reloading process. So to reload the Colt Walker, I have to do so with the cylinder in place as it is now. To start this process, I'm going to first have to place the hammer on half cock, which deactivates the cylinder stop, allowing me to freely rotate the cylinder. And we're going to have to remove all of the spent caps that haven't fallen off on their own before we can continue on. And once that is finished, we're going to go ahead and start pouring powder into the first chamber here. And then we're going to follow up the powder with a ball. So we're going to place the ball on the chamber mouth, rotate it around, and then ram it home with the ramrod here. Now, the reason you need to do that is because in a cap and ball revolver, the ball is actually going to be oversized to the dimension of the cylinder. And the reason this is done is to have a nice seal to prevent chain fires. What a chain fire is if you fired off one chamber, the expanding gases that leak out from that chamber could possibly go into the next chamber, firing that off, and possibly firing off all of the chambers, depending on just how much that gas leaks in and how unlucky you are, really. And the problem with a chain fire is not only having chambers that you don't intend to fire are firing, but also some of the chambers that are in line with parts of the frame or the barrel could possibly do some catastrophic damage to the firearm itself and possibly harm the operator of the firearm or anyone nearby. This is obviously a bad consequence. It's something you want to avoid, so that's the reason why the balls are oversized as they are. With the last ball seated, finally, we place fresh caps on all of the nipples, rotating the cylinder around as we do so. And if we come out in the X-ray, really the only place we can place the caps is in this position here where there's a cutout in the frame to allow for it. Now, there is an inherent flaw in cap and ball revolvers relating to the caps. So not only do you have the issue of possible chain fires, but you also have the issue of the caps themselves. They have a habit when they're struck by the hammer to break apart, and pieces of the caps can sometimes get lodged in the mechanism of the revolver and jam up the works, and that is a problem that is faced with these cap and ball revolvers. The next example we're going to take a look at is the Colt Single Action Army, and for the purposes of this video, the main difference between this revolver and the previous example we took a look at is the introduction of self-contained cartridges, which are going to alleviate some of the problems we had with cap and ball revolvers. For instance, you're not going to have chain fires because the cartridge itself is going to seal the powder away behind the bullet, and also you're not going to have the caps breaking apart because there are no caps. There's instead primers inserted into the base of the cartridge case. Because the rest of the mechanism of the firearm is pretty much the same as that of the previous example we took a look at outside of the reloading procedure, which is related to the ammunition, we're mostly going to be glossing over some of this functionality, just identifying the main parts. So let's go ahead and start with that. So we have the cylinder stop, and the hand. And just like what we saw before, as we cock the hammer back, the hand is going to come up. It's going to engage in the ratchet teeth on the cylinder. Now, the hand is shaped a little bit differently than the hand we saw before. It actually has two little fingers on it, and this just helps it engage the next ratchet along. As you can see, once the hand slides past the first ratchet tooth, this part of the hand is going to grab onto that last remaining part to rotate the cylinder along the rest of the way. And if we move over to the other side, we can see the cylinder stop in action. So just like before, we have a peg here on the hammer. And as the hammer gets cocked back, it's going to lift up on one end of the cylinder stop, bringing the other end down, allowing the cylinder to rotate freely. And once the cylinder stop goes beyond the peg on the hammer, the spring is going to act upon the cylinder stop, bringing it up, but it won't yet be able to go into a notch because the notch hasn't aligned itself yet. So it just kind of slide along the outside of the cylinder. And this is why on some revolvers you see a line kind of like this worn into the outside of the cylinder, because the cylinder stop actually drags along the outside of the cylinder, and then it falls into this cutout part here and eventually comes up into the locking notch itself and locks the cylinder in place. The resetting of the cylinder stop occurs pretty much the same way as it did in the previous example. As the hammer comes down, the cylinder stop will slide up the slope surface of the peg, and eventually, once the peg goes beyond, it will snap back down in place. Now, the timing on this animation and the program is not particularly good. As you can see, it starts being squeezed in before the peg even gets there, but the true timing of this would be that that would get squeezed in once the peg comes into contact. It would get squeezed in fully, and then it would snap back in place the second the peg passed it. But we have a lot of delay here because the animation timing is not exactly perfect. And if we come around to the other side with the hand, the resetting of the hand is pretty much what we've seen before. So as the hammer comes forward, the hand is going to slide along the sloped surface of one of the ratchet teeth and get pushed backwards. This is going to compress a flat spring, which once the hand goes beyond the ratchet tooth, it is going to push the hand back forward and underneath the ratchet tooth so that it can be acted upon again. Let's now move on to the reloading process. As I said, this is the main difference between this example and the previous one. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the hammer on half cock to disable the cylinder stop so we can freely rotate the cylinder, which we have to do by hand. We open the loading gate to allow us to pop out the spent cases with the ejector rod. So the ejector rod here is a spring-loaded rod that we push in to knock out the cases. Literally, the rod just comes in and knocks out the spent cartridge case by pushing on the back of the case and just popping it out of the chamber. And then its spring-loaded nature, we just have to let go of the ejector rod and it comes back forward. And you just repeat this process, knocking out a spent cartridge case and then putting in a fresh cartridge, and then moving on to the next one until you have all of the spent cartridge cases and you've reloaded all of the chambers with fresh cartridges. Close the loading gate, and then you can either fully cock the hammer or lower it back down as the animation shows. The next example we're going to take a look at is the Colt Python, which is going to be a representative of a more modern revolver design. And with this example, we're going to have a few new concepts. First, we have a swing-out cylinder rather than a fixed cylinder like what we had in the previous two examples. And we also have a double-action mechanism rather than a single-action mechanism like in our previous two examples, among other changes. So let's start off, as we've done before, by identifying the three main components. So we have the cylinder itself with the ratchet at the back of the cylinder, but not actually part of the cylinder now because of some differences in the swing-out cylinder design. We have the hand here, which is now affixed to the trigger rather than the hammer. And we have the cylinder stop here. So let's go ahead and cock the hammer back and see what happens. So as the hammer gets cocked back, the hammer is going to act upon the trigger. As you can see, this part of the trigger comes up and the hammer is hooked underneath that. So as the hammer is cocked back, it's going to pull up on the trigger. And as the trigger is pulled up on, the hand is also going to move up, as we've seen before. So the hand's going to come up, go underneath this ratchet tooth here, and rotate the cylinder along. Now, I will admit, like we've seen before, this animation's a little rough. As you can see, the hand actually clips into the ratchet tooth here, and the timing is not all that great, but it at least shows the overall motion of the hand. And you're just going to have to use your imagination on how that hand is acting upon that ratchet because the animation doesn't do a very good job of showing it there. But just as we saw in our previous example, this part of the hand is going to slide along this ratchet tooth, and then this part of the hand is going to take over once that part of the hand, the initial part, has slid far enough beyond that ratchet that it can no longer really act upon it to get it to rotate the rest of the way around. It just, the poor execution of this animation doesn't really showcase that. So that's not a whole lot different than what we've seen in the past. Mostly the main difference is that the hand is affixed to the trigger rather than the hammer. And that's just differences in the double action mechanism that is required in that. Now the cylinder stop itself is not going to be acted upon by the hammer. As a matter of fact, it's a very indirect interaction here. But let's first watch it from this angle and see what happens. So as we've seen before, the cylinder stop is going to be pivoted and be forced down to unlock it from the cylinder, and then it's going to compress a spring here, which is a coil spring rather than a flat spring, as we've seen in the past. And what acts upon it is actually this lever here. So this lever fits in between the hand and trigger. So as the trigger gets pivoted, the pin that connects the hand to the trigger is going to lift up on the lever. And as the lever gets lifted up on, it's going to lift up on this end of the cylinder stop, which brings this end of the cylinder stop down. So it's the same idea, just executed a little bit differently. And as the lever gets lifted up, eventually the cylinder stop here will go beyond this sloped surface here. You might just be able to make out. And again, the animation's a little poor, as you can see it kind of clipping through there. But it's going to go beyond that sloped surface, and it's going to fall away from the lever. As we can see now, the lever has actually gone beyond it, which is going to allow the cylinder stop to come back up. But as before, the cylinder isn't yet in a line, so it's going to just slide along the outside of the cylinder until it comes into this groove. Then it's going to slide along the groove. The spring is going to start to act upon it, pushing it up. And eventually it's going to push it up fully, locking the cylinder stop in place and locking the cylinder itself in place. Now let's take a look at the reset of the hand and the cylinder stop. So as we pull the trigger, the hammer is going to come forward. But as we discussed earlier, the hand is tied to the trigger and the cylinder stop is tied to this lever here. So neither one of them are going to move as this hammer comes forward, as you can see here. It's not until the operator of the firearm releases the trigger and the trigger starts to come forward that we're going to see the hand move. And what causes the trigger to come forward is the lever itself. So the lever is going to be acted upon by this V-spring here, which has been compressed. And once the trigger is released, that spring is going to force the lever down, which pushes down on the pin here that attaches the hand to the trigger, which brings the trigger down and also brings the hand with it. And then the hand resets into its former position. And on the reverse side, the cylinder stop is going to contact a sloped surface here on the lever and get pushed down a little bit. So you're going to see that this end of the lever gets pushed down a little bit. So this end goes up a little bit to allow the lever to go past the cylinder stop. I know this is animated very poorly here, and you're not really seeing this represented exactly as it would look, but you get the overall idea. So the cylinder stop is being pushed down a little bit to allow the lever to go past it. I know it just shows the cylinder stop going straight through the physical surface of the lever, but in reality, that's what would happen, is it would just kind of get pushed down and then the lever would slide past it. Once the lever slides enough along the cylinder stop to get underneath it, the cylinder stop will just fall back down on this end, just due to gravity, and the cylinder stop will then be above the lever so that the lever can act upon it. With the Colt Python, we have yet another reloading process to go over, as now we have a swing-out cylinder, as opposed to our previous example, which had a fixed cylinder. So to start the reloading process, we first need to activate the cylinder release latch by pulling back on it. And what this does is it pulls back on a retaining pin that keeps the cylinder held in place. So once we pull back on that, the cylinder is free to swing out to the left side here, along the axis point of the crane here in the frame. It's going to swing out. And once we've swung it out fully, we can press on the ejector rod here, which is attached to the extractor star at the back of the cylinder. So this is the extractor star. And I mentioned earlier that the ratchet teeth are not actually directly attached to the cylinder itself because they're attached to the extractor star instead. And when the extractor star is pushed to the rear, it will latch onto the rims of the cartridge cases and pull them out of the cylinder. And if enough force is applied to the ejector, this will actually punch the cartridges free from the cylinder, as we'll see here. And then once we release the ejector, a spring on the inside here of the crane arm will bring the extractor back forward, and then we can bring in fresh cartridges, and we're using a speed loader in this instance to load in all of the cartridges at once. Drop the cartridges in place, and then we can start to push the cylinder back in place, which will act upon the cylinder latch. And pretty much the cylinder itself will push upon the pin and cylinder latch to bring them back to the rear. And then once the cylinder is fully in, a spring here on the cylinder release latch will act upon it to bring that pin back forward and retain the cylinder again. And that's pretty much the reloading process for a swing out style revolver. And that wraps up this part of my series covering how revolvers work. I've decided to break up this video series into two parts due to the complexity of the subject and the time required to explain it. This first part was put together in a way that a viewer could walk away with a basic understanding on how most modern revolvers work. It also only focuses on one manufacturer's products for simplicity's sake. In the next part, I'm going to cover some alternative brands and methods of operation, as well as take a look at more unusual styles of revolver, and in general give a more in-depth look at how revolvers work. In any case, I hope you guys have enjoyed the video. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.